I've been swinging this hammer for a mighty long time. Wood I wouldn't give for a nickel and a dime. I was up there in the hills where the color bands run, fanning across a mountain and shining in the sun. I came across a mountain, it was leaning tall. One wrong look and she was bound to fall. But I couldn't resist where my fortune lied. Now I'm bound to get rich if I keep from dying. Well, I keep on chipping and chipping away. There's a little more gold left here today. All I gotta do is just pull it right from the ground. Every time I take a little piece, I know I'm towing the line with the open core, and sooner or later this whole thing is coming down. Well, I heard a little crack, heard a creak and moan. It sounded like thunder and it shook me to the bone. Just got a little bit more to go. $10,000 and I'm headed back home. I finally had my fill, I was on my way. And that mountain started falling as I ran and I prayed. Lord, if you let me make it out alive, I'll never chase another pole for my whole damn life. Well, I keep on chipping and chipping away. There's a little more gold left here today. All I gotta do is just pull it right from the ground. Every time I take a little piece, I know I'm towing the line with the open core, and sooner or later this whole thing is coming down. This sooner or later this whole thing is coming down. This sooner or later this whole thing is coming down.
Weatherton had been 3 months out of Horsehead before he found his first color. At first there was a few scattered grains taken from the base of a alluvial fan where millions of tons of sand and silt had washed down from the chain of rugged peaks. Yet the gold was ragged under the magnifying glass. Gold that had carried any distance between becomes worn and polished by the abrasive action of the accompanying rocks and sand, so this could not have been carried far. With caution, born of harsh experience, he seated himself and lighted his pipe, yet excitement was strong within him. A contemplative man by nature, experience had taught him how a man may be deluded by hope, yet all his instincts told him the source of gold was somewhere on the mountain above. It could have come down the wash that skirted the base of the mountain, but that ragged condition of the gold made that improbable. The base of the fan was half a mile across and hundreds of feet thick, built of silt and sand and washed down by centuries of erosion among the higher peaks. The point of the wide V of the fan lay between the two towering upthrusts of granite. But from where Weatherton sat, he could see that the actual source of the fan lay much higher. Weatherton made camp near a tiny spring west of the fan, then picketed his burros and began his climb. When he was well over 2,000 feet higher, he stopped, resting again, and while resting, he dry panned some of the silt. Surprisingly, there was more than a few grains of gold even in that first pan, so he continued his climb and passed at last between the towering portals of the granite columns. Above this, the natural gate was smaller, 3 smaller alluvial fans that joined at the gate to pour into the greater fan below. Dry panning 2 of these brought no results, but the third, even by the relatively poor method of dry panning, showed a dozen colors, all of good size. The head of this fan lay in a gigantic crack in a granitic upthrust that resembled a fantastic ruin. Pausing to catch his breath, his gaze wandered along the base of this upthrust, and right before him the crumbling granite was slashed with a vein of quartz that was literally laced with gold. Struggling nearer through the loose sand, his heart pounding, more from excitement from altitude than exertion, he came to an abrupt stop. The band of quartz was 6 feet wide, and that 6 feet was cobwebbed with gold. It was unbelievable, but here it was. Yet even in the moment of success, something about the beetling cliff stopped him from going forward. His innate caution took hold, and he drew back to examine it at greater length. Wary of what he saw, he circled the batholith and then climbed to the ridge behind it, from which he could look down upon the roof. What he saw from there left him dry-mouthed and jittery. The granitic upthrust was obviously a part of a much older range, one that had been weathered and worn, and suffered from shock and twisting, until finally the tower of granite had been violently upthrust, leaving it standing, a shaky ruin among younger and sturdier peaks. In the process, the rock had shattered and riven by mighty forces until it became a miner's horror. Weatherton stared, fascinated by the prospect, with enormous wealth here for the taking. Every ounce must be taken at the risk of life. One stick of powder might bring down the whole crumbling mass down in a heap, and it loomed all of 300 feet above its base in the fan. The room of the batholith was riven above its base, riven with gigantic cracks, literally seamed with breaks like the wall of an ancient building that has remained standing after heavy bombing. Walking back to the base of the tower, Weatherton found he could actually break loose chunks of the quartz with his finger. The vein itself lay on the downhill side and at the very base. The outer wall of the upthrust was sharply tilted so that a man working in the vein would be cutting his way into the very foundations of the tower, and any single blow of the pick might bring the whole mass down upon him. Furthermore, if the rock did fall, the vein would be hopelessly buried under thousands of tons of rock and lost without the expenditure of much more than capital that he could command. And at this moment, Weatherton's total money in hand amounted to slightly less than $40. 30 yards from the face, he seated himself upon the sand and filled his pipe once more. A man might take tons out of there and without trouble, and yet it might collapse at the first blow. Yet he knew he had no choice. He needed money, and he laid it before him. Even if he were at first successful there were two things he must avoid. The first was tolerance of danger that might bring carelessness. The second, the urge to go back for that, quote, little bit more, unquote, that could kill him. It was well into the afternoon, he had not eaten, and yet he was not hungry. He circled the batholith, studied it from every angle, only to reach the conclusion that his first estimate had been correct. The only way to get to the gold was to go into the very shadow of the leading wall and attack it at its base, digging out by main strength. From where he stood, it seemed ridiculous that a mere man with a pick could topple that massive rock, yet he knew how delicate such a balance could be. The tower was situated on what might be described as the military crest of the ridge, and the alluvial fence sloped steeply away from the lower sides, steeper than a steep stairway. The top of the leaning wall overshadowed the top of the fan, and it started to crumble. And a man's head of warning. He might run to the north with a bare chance of escape. The soft sand in which he must run would be an impediment, but that could be alleviated by making a walk from flat rocks sunken into the sand. It was dusk when he returned to camp. Deliberately, he had not permitted himself to work. Not so much by any as a sample. He must be deliberate in all his actions, and never for a second should he forget the mass that towered above him. A split-second hesitation when the crash came, and he accepted it as inevitable, would mean burial under tons of crumbled rock. The following morning, he picketed his burros on a small meadow near the spring, and cleaned the spring itself, and prepared a lunch. Then he removed his shirt, drew on a pair of gloves, and walked to the face of the cliff. Yet even then he did not begin, knowing that upon this habit of care and deliberation might depend only on his successes in the adventure, but life itself. He gathered flat stones and began building his walk. When you start moving, he told himself, you have to be fast. Finally, and with infinite care, he began tapping at the quartz, enlarging cracks with the pick, removing fragments, but then prying loose whole chunks. He did not swing the pick, but used it as a lever. The quartz was rotten, and a man might obtain a considerable amount by this method of picking or even of pulling with the hands. We had a sack filled with the richest quartz he had carried over its path to a safe place beyond the shadow of the tower. Returning, he tamped with a few more flat rocks into his path and began on the second sack. He worked with greater care than was perhaps essential. He was not and had never been a gambling man. In the present operation, he was taking a careful calculated risk in which every eventuality had been weighted. And judged. He needed money, and he intended to have it. He had a good idea of his chances of success, but knew that his greatest danger was to become too greedy, too much engrossed in his task. Dragging the two sacks down the hill, he found a flat block of stone, and with it a single jack proceeded to break up the quartz. It was a slow and hard job, but he had no better means of extracting the gold. After breaking or crushing the quartz, much of the gold could be separated by a knife blade, for it was amazingly concentrated. With water from the spring, Weatherton panned the remainder until it was too dark to see. Out of his blankets by daybreak, he ate breakfast and completed the extraction of gold. At a rough estimate, his first day's work would run to $400. He made a cachet for the gold sack and took the now empty ore sacks and climbed back to the tower. The air was clear and fresh, the sun warm after the chill of night. And he liked the feel of the pick in his hands. Laura and Tommy waited him back in Horsehead, and if he was killed here, there was small chance they would ever know what would have become of him. But he did not intend to be killed. The gold he was to extract from this rock was for them, not for himself. It would mean an easier life in a larger town, a home of their own, and the things to make the home a woman desires. And it meant an education for Tommy. For himself, all he needed was the thought of that home to return to, his wife and son, and the desert itself. And one was as necessary to him as the other. The desert would be the death of him. He had been told that many times, and did not need to be told, for few men knew the desert as he did. The desert was to him what an orchestra is to a fine conductor, what a human body is to a surgeon. It was his work, his life, the thing he knew best. He always smiled when he looked first into the desert and started a new trip. Would this be it? The morning drew on, and as he continued to work with an even paced swing of the pick, a careful filling of the sack, the gold shone bright and beautiful, and the crystalline quartz was so much more beautiful than the gold itself. From time to time, as the morning drew on, he paused to rest and breathe deeply of fresh, clean air, clear air. Deliberately, he refused to hurry. For 19 days, he worked tirelessly, 8 hours a day, and then, at first, lessening his hours to 7 and then to 6. Weatherton did not need to explain to himself why he did this, but he realized it was becoming increasingly difficult to stay on the job. Again and again, he would walk away from the rock to face one excuse or another, and then each time he would begin to feel his scalp prickle, his steps grow quicker, and each time he returned more reluctantly. 3 times beginning on the 13th, again on the 17th, and finally on the 19th day, he heard movement within the tower. Whether that whispering in the rock was normal, he did not know. Such a natural movement might have been going on for centuries. He only knew that it happened now, and each time it happened, a cold chill went through his spine. His work had cut a deep notch at the base of the tower, such a notch as might have been felling a tree, but wider and deeper. The sacks of gold, too, were increasing. They now numbered 7, and their total would, he believed, amount to more than $5,000, probably nearer to $6,000. As he cut deeper into the rock, the vein was growing richer. He worked on his knees now. The vein had slanted downward as he cut into the base of the tower, and all he was 9 feet into a rock with a great mass of it above him. If that rock gave way while he was working his work, he would be crushed in an instant with no chance of escape. Nevertheless, he continued. Change in the rock tower was not only change, for he had lost weight and he no longer slept well. On the night of the 20th day, he decided he had $6,000 and his goal was to be $10,000, and the following day the rock would be the richest ever. As if to tantalize him into working on and on, the deeper he cut, the richer the ore became. By nightfall of that day, he had taken out more than $1,000. Now the lust of the gold was getting into him, taking him by the throat. He was fascinated by the danger of the tower as well as the desire for gold. 3 more days to go. Could he leave it then? He looked again at the tower and felt a peculiar sense of foreboding, a feeling that here he was to die, and he would never escape. Was it his imagination, or had the outer wall leaned a little more? On the morning of the 22nd day, he climbed the fan over the path that he had built into a series of continuous steps. He had never counted those steps, but there must have been over 1,000 of them. Dropping his canteen into a shaded hollow and pick in hand, he started for the tower. Forward tilt did seem somewhat more than before. Or was it the light? The crack that ran behind the outer wall seemed to have widened, and when he examined it more closely, he found a small pile of freshly run silt near the bottom of the crack. So it had moved. Weatherton hesitated, staring at the rock with wary attention. He was a fool to go back in there again. $7,000 was more than he could ever have in his life before. Yet in the next few hours, he could take out at least $1,000 more. And in the next 3 days, he could easily have $10,000 he set for his goal. He walked to the opening, dropped to his knees, and crawled in the narrow, flat-roofed hole. No sooner was he inside that fear climbed to his throat. He felt trapped, stifled. But he fought down the mounting panic and began to work. His first blows were so frightening and feeble that nothing came loose. Yet, when he did get started, he began to work with a feverish intensity that was wholly unlike him. When he slowed and then stopped to fill his sack, he was gasping for breath. But despite his hurry, the sack was not quite full. Reluctantly, he He lifted his pick again, but before he could not strike a blow, the gigantic mass above him seemed to creak like something tired and old. A deep shudder went through his colossal pile, and then a deep grinding that turned him sick with horror. All his plans for instant flight were frozen, and it was not until the groaning ceased that he realized that he was lying on his back, breathless with fear and expectancy. Slowly he edged his way into the air and walked, fighting the desire to run away from the rock. When he stopped near the canteen, he was wringing with cold sweat and trembling in every muscle. He sat down on the rock and fought for control. It was not until some 20 minutes had passed that he could trust himself to get back to his feet. Despite his experience, he knew that if he did not go back now, he would never go. He had out but one sack for the day and had wanted another. Circling the batholith, he had examined the widening crack, endeavoring again for the third time to find another means of access to the vein. The tilt of the outer wall was obvious and could stand no more without toppling. It was possible that by cutting into the wall of the column and striking down, he might tap the vein at a safer point. Yet this added blow at the foundation would bring the tower near to collapse and render his other hole untenable. Even this new attempt would not be safe, although immeasurably more secure than the hole he had left. Hesitating, he looked back at the hole. Once more. The ore was now fabulously rich, and the few pounds he needed to complete the sack, he could get in just a little while. He stared at the black and undoubtedly narrow hole, and then looked up at the leaning wall. He picked up his pick, and his mouth dry, started to get back, drawn by a fascination that was beyond all reason. His heart pounding, he dropped to his knees at the tunnel face. The air seemed stifling, and he could feel his scalp tingling. But once he started to crawl, it was better. The face where he now worked was at least 16 feet from the tunnel mouth. Pick in hand, he began to wedge chunks from their seat. The going seemed harder now, and the chunks did not seem to loose so easily. Above him, the tower made no sound. The crushing weight was now something tangible. He could almost feel it growing, increasing with every move of his. The mountain seemed resting on his shoulder, crushing the air from his lungs. Suddenly he stopped. His sack almost full. He stopped and lay very still, staring up at the bulk of the rock above him. No. He would go no farther. Now he would quit. Not another sackful, not another pound. He would go out now. He would go down the mountain without a backward look, and he would keep going. His wife waiting at home, little Tommy, who would run gladly to meet him. These were too much to gamble. With the decision came peace, came certainty. He sighed deeply and relaxed, and then it seemed to him that every muscle in his body had been knotted with strain. He turned on his side and with great deliberation gathered his lantern, his sack, his handpick. He had won. He had defeated the crumbling tower. He had defeated his own greed. He backed easily without the caution that had marked his earlier movements in the cave. His blind, trusting foot found the projecting rock, a piece of quartz that stuck out from the rough-hewn wall. The blow was too weak, too feeble to have brought forth the reaction that followed. The rock seemed to quiver like the flesh of a beast when stabbed. A queer vibration went through the ancient rock, then a deep, gasping sigh. He had waited too long. Fear came swiftly in upon him, crowding him while his body twisted, contracting into the smallest possible space. He tried to will his muscles, but to move beneath the growing sounds that vibrated through the passage. The whisper of the rock grew into a terrifying groan, and there was a rattle of pebbles, and silence. Silence was more horrifying than the sound. Somehow he was crawling, even as he expected the avalanche of gold to bury him. Abruptly his feet were on the open. He was out. He ran without stopping, and behind him he heard a growing roar that he couldn't outrace. When he knew from the slope of the land that he must be safe from falling rock, he fell to his knees. He turned and looked back. The muted roaring sound, like thunder beyond mountains, continued, but there was no visible change in the tower. Suddenly he watched the whole rock formation seem to shift and tip. The movement lasted only seconds, but before the tons of rock had found their new equilibrium, his tunnel and area around it had utterly vanished from sight. When he could finally stand, Weatherton gathered up his sack of ore and his canteen. The wind was cool upon his face as he walked away, and he did not look back again.